Well, I want to welcome you all today to session 2 of Start Where They Are, a workshop for an audience of people who care about very young kids with a diagnosis of autism. I'm Nancy Popkin. I'm one of the autism resource specialists with the Autism Society of North Carolina. I am based in the Charlotte area, and I'm the parent of a 29-year-old with autism, but I vividly remember those early years when he was first diagnosed. And last week I talked about sort of a framework we want to keep in mind for the upcoming sessions. We talked about core characteristics of autism and understanding our kids through the lens of autism. And that doesn't mean just understanding all the things that are hard, but understanding their strengths in areas of communication and socialization, thinking, learning, sensory responses, and behaviors. We talked about all of those things. And we talked about focusing not only on what their skills are in each of those areas, but also understanding what their interests are, what motivates them, what do they enjoy doing, and what is their sort of bandwidth for engaging. We want to know all of those things, that we use it as a platform to get into today's discussion about promoting self-advocacy and joy through social interactions. So I'm going to introduce Louise Southern, who's here to bring us through our session today. I'll chime in as we go, but I'm so glad that you're here. Louise, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, and I'm happy to be here with you all as well. Obviously, it's such a great opportunity for me to partner with Nancy, who is not only a professional in this field, but also is the parent of an individual with autism, and so she has that lived experience that I don't have to help inform my work, and I appreciate that. So without further ado, let's get started. So where are we going today? We're really going to focus on talking about addressing those individually determined forms of self-advocacy. How do we promote self-advocacy in all of its forms in young children with autism? And how do we build social connectedness within this context? That's really what we're going to be focusing on today. Obviously, we also want to, in future webinar sessions that we're going to hold, we're going to talk about promoting independence in daily living routines, as well as we're going to get at positive behavior support strategies that promote safety for young children with autism. Today is really all about self-advocacy and social connectedness. And at the end of the day, our aims are to support individuals with autism wherever they are along the spectrum and wherever they are along the lifespan in establishing empowerment and having individually determined forms of empowerment and achieving joy and quality of life. And that looks different for different people. I don't define what a person with autism's quality of life is. They have to define that for themselves, and you as their parents and caregivers define that. So we're happy to talk about these topics of promoting social communication, self-advocacy, and social interaction. So when we think about self-advocacy, obviously you all in this audience are supporting very young children with autism. Self-advocacy starts at a very early point in development. In typical child development, it starts when babies cry. They begin self-advocating around their fundamental needs and wants. It starts when very young children are looking towards their caregiver as if to communicate their needs, their feelings, their thoughts. It comes in the form of using gestures to communicate. It comes in the form of vocalizing, for some, not all, but vocalizing their needs and wants and thoughts and feelings. Communication comes in a lot of different forms. And for very young children, this is where it starts, is starting with helping our young children with autism to be able to express those basic wants and needs and thoughts and feelings, giving them choice, giving them an opportunity to exert their preferences, to have control over the situation as best we can, allowing them the opportunities to also deny or dissent when they don't want something to happen, because that's a critical form of self-advocacy as well. So this is where we're going to spend some time focusing today as it relates to our youngest children with autism. Broadly, self-advocacy is really all about knowing yourself, first and foremost, and that means knowing your strengths, your wants, your needs, what are you good at, what are you not good at, knowing what you need and what you want, and then knowing how to get it. And that is something all of us as adults are continuing to evolve in. And so self-advocacy is a lifelong process for any individual, including those on the spectrum. And so today we're really going to be starting by focusing on those earliest forms of self-advocacy. I love this quote from Stephen Shore. Stephen Shore is an autistic adult. And I just wanted you to have this as a reference for you. But self-advocacy involves knowing when and how to approach others to negotiate desired goals, to build better mutual understanding and trust, and to achieve fulfillment and productivity. Successful self-advocacy often involves a certain amount of disclosure about oneself to reach the goal of better mutual understanding. Obviously, again, we're talking about very young children, so this might sound like a complex set of skills that are involved in what Stephen's describing here, but it starts with basic forms of communication and giving children the power to say what they want, what they don't want, what they need, what they enjoy, and so forth. When we think about young children with autism, the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what is their starting point? Where is your child right now in terms of their communication skills or repertoire, so to speak? How do they currently communicate their wants, their needs, their thoughts, their feelings? Nancy did such a great job in the last session, really emphasizing this point of starting where you are, starting where the child is right now as our fundamental point at which we build from. Some of these children are vocally communicating, of course, but that's not where everyone is starting in this audience, and we know that. So just as the autism spectrum is very wide, so too is the communication spectrum for children with autism. Communication comes in so many different forms. It comes in the form of self-acquisition, which means the child just goes and gets what they want. Maybe that means they're climbing up on the kitchen counter to go get what they want, but they're getting what they want. It might involve them leading or guiding you, taking your hand and pulling you in the direction of the things that they want. It might involve them approaching you as if to communicate or to initiate an interaction or a communication. It may come in the form of smiles and laughs, reaching, pointing, looking towards us. It may come in more vocal language forms of babbling or word approximation. So children who are saying parts of words but maybe can't say the whole word. It may come in the form of sign language or modified signs to communicate. It may come in the form of picture exchange, or it may come in the form of a child pointing to what they want from a menu of options, whether that's on a picture board, whether that's on a tablet device, or any other augmentative communication tool. And of course, it can come in the form of vocal language, words, phrases, full sentences, and so forth. So communication is across the spectrum. We see a wide range of entry points for communication. And so what we would encourage you to do is think about the child you're supporting and think about where are they right now? What is the starting point that we would build on? That's the critical question to ask first. And of course, some children use challenging behavior and to communicate around their wants and their needs and their frustration and their confusion. And so it's critical to recognize that what we sometimes see as a failure to behave properly is actually a failure to communicate properly. For young children with autism who are exhibiting challenging or interfering behavior, we know that in so many of those cases, those behaviors are a form of expression. They are communicating a message to us. They are communicating an unmet need to us. And so when we recognize that that's what a lot of challenging behavior is communicating to us, it can lead us in the direction of strategies that we can apply and communication skills that we can teach that can empower those young children with better ways to get their needs met. So this is a critical piece that we're going to come back to when we go into session 4 on addressing challenging behavior through positive behavior support strategies. We're going to hit this point hard again with a number of strategies and interventions. Everyone deserves a way to say these messages. No, not yet. I'm all done. I need a break. Stop. Give me space. And so on. These are critical messages, critical self-advocacy messages that we have to hear and respect and honor. And for some children with autism, we have to explicitly teach them how to communicate around these needs. Otherwise, of course, we can expect young children to communicate these messages through forms of challenging behavior. And so this is a key area where if you're working with a young child, we want to teach them ways to communicate these messages. The way that they communicate those messages might not be verbal, right? And it might not even be through forms of sign language or picture exchange. It might come in the form of pushing an item away as if to say, I don't want that item right now. Or it might come in the form of a gesture, a head shake, as if to say, no, I don't want that right now. So thinking about, again, what is your child's current communication entry point? That's where we want to start to build from. And right out of the gate, just like we're trying to teach young children to request around their wants and their needs, we also need to make sure we're teaching them ways to dissent, to say what they don't want. These are critical self-advocacy messages across the spectrum and across the lifespan that are really important for us to address. And so as it relates to communication, again, not all children with autism, as we well know, are vocally communicating. Even if they should, even when compared to their same age peers, maybe we would expect them to be vocally communicating at this point. But of course, maybe they're not. Maybe language has not yet developed. Of course, for some children, maybe vocal language might not ever develop. That is completely individually determined, and there's not always an easy way to predict how that will develop over time. But what we do know is that there are a wide range of augmentative and alternative communication tools that can support individuals on the autism spectrum in being able to communicate around their thoughts, their wants, their needs, and so forth. For some children with autism, we see, and research suggests that for some children with autism, when we use these augmentative communication tools, and we teach children how to use them, they can serve as a bridge to vocal communication. They can augment or support the development of vocal communication over time. And so again, thinking about where is your child at, what might be the right starting point. For some young children, these augmentative communication tools, examples are the right place to start. For others, we have to start more basic, even than these forms of communication. Maybe even dialing it back to gestures, to body language, to eye gaze, and so forth in order to support those children in being able to communicate initially. Augmentative and alternative communication tools can come in a wide variety of forms. They don't all have to be higher tech, like some of the ones you see here. They might be lower tech forms of communication that support communication. Basic choice boards, as you can see examples here, photo-based choice forms that are posted on the refrigerator. I think this is from Nancy's own home library.
No, that I have one coming up, but these are, I mean, this includes objects even, and I think the ones on the refrigerator, there's some things like in Ziploc bags attached to those pictures.
Yeah, so really concrete, making these visual cues very concrete for very young children with autism or children who need us to present this information in very concrete forms to signal to them, here are your choices. And then what we would do in this context is the child would point to or reach or grab one of those visual cues. And ideally, maybe they would point to it or they would hand that visual cue to us. And that's the form of communication exchange we're looking for, as if to say, this is what I want. And then obviously we as caregivers in that moment would want to honor those requests. So again, these kinds of visual options can convey to a child, what are my choices right now? What are the menu of options available to me? And giving that child a way to understand their choices in a way that's more understandable to them. Obviously, if we verbally deliver options or we say something like, what do you want to do? Do you want to go on a walk or play iPad or go to the park? Not all children with autism are going to understand those verbally delivered options. And so in many cases, we have to visually support what we're offering verbally. These sorts of augmentative tools that convey options and offer the individual choices, they come in a wide variety of forms across the spectrum. And as we look to learners, young children who are advancing in age, who might be ready to read and comprehend written text, it can look like this. So again, it's important just that you understand that what we're trying to convey is that across the spectrum and across the span, these communication tools evolve over time as the individual develops. and they're customized to meet the specific individual needs of that young learner. I know Nancy
These are
wants
some,
this.
yeah,
Yeah.
these are some that we used early on. Were to ask for help, clearly, um, but not clearly to our son initially. And interestingly enough, it is the one on the right that says the word help. That was where we started when he was 3 years old, and he could not read that word. What we did, though, was build meaning into that card. So whenever he was exhibiting um, his forms of communication, that he needed help, that he was in a situation beyond his control or capacity to solve, it looked like crying for him. And so when we wanted to teach him how to get a person to ask for help, we used that card that said the word help on it. And we would come to him and bring him the card and put it in his hand. It looks like you need help. And then we would take his hand holding the card and put it back in our hand and say, I can help you. And we wouldn't give him help until he gave us that card. And we had those cards in every room of the house, so that every time he was somewhere and he was crying, we would direct him to use the card instead. We wouldn't help him until he gave us the card. And I want to point out that while the card is not yellow, there is a yellow string on that card, and he gravitated very strongly to the color yellow. We incorporated that into the card by putting that string there. So, so that was where we started. The other card you see is what his help cue looked like when he was in 5th grade through middle school. And it evolved again over time to something very sophisticated. I'll show you probably in session 4. But we've always had access for him to some form of nonverbal communication. And it's important to know that he's always been able to talk. But when he's in distress, his ability to say what he wants to say is significantly lower. And so he always has access, even as an adult, to nonverbal communication tools that he can use when he's in a situation beyond his control. So that's where I want to start with that one. And then I think the next slide as well is an example of a choice board that we used early on. He was very overwhelmed by choices, and this was something that we made to support his communication. And you know, it was interesting. First, I want to point out that these are not fancy, as Louise was saying. I cut out the labels of cereal boxes and Velcroed them to a shoebox lid. And this was given to him in the morning when he needed to tell me what he wanted for lunch. I would ask, before I used this, I asked him, what do you want for lunch? He was in kindergarten. And that would just result in a meltdown while we were trying to get ready for school, which was not easy. And he would take dry cereal for lunch and get milk and eat them separately. But I wouldn't give him all of those labels at once. I would only give him, you know, maybe 2. We wouldn't have all those cereals in our house at once. So whatever we had, maybe 2 choices, he would get those. And so to address the tantrum, I thought that it was too many choices for him. He needed to have a visual rather than the verbal reminder. And so I created this board, gave it to him. He knew exactly what to do with it. He would pick the one he wanted, and there was a Velcro piece on the lunch bag, and he would put it on there, and that communicated to me what he wanted. And that ended the tantrums. And what was super interesting about this was that the tantrums for that situation. But when he was 8 years old, he asked me if I ever wondered why he got upset when I asked him what he wanted for lunch. And I said, well, it was too many choices. And I thought if I made it visual, it would be easier. He said, no, it was because I was eating breakfast and you were asking me about lunchtime, and it's not lunchtime. So I was solving a problem that I didn't realize, which was that he's so literal that it was the wrong time of day to ask him what he wanted for lunch. He couldn't figure that out. But not having the conversation, making it visual, lowered his anxiety about that situation. So I was addressing a different characteristic, but all of that resulted in him beginning to trust that I was understanding him, and made him more confident as he moved through his day, that he had more control over things. So these are really meaningful, because control is something that we want to give them, that sense of security, and control that helps them feel confident and trust the people around them. So
Yeah. That just empowering young children with, I have a voice, even if it's not vocal, right? But I have a
mhm,
voice, have a
yeah.
choice. That gives me a sense of power and control over my life. And that all ultimately certainly can prevent some of the challenging behaviors and meltdowns that we might see. And,
Mhm.
I know Nancy, I probably had to experience this, right? This level of complexity that you see here isn't probably where her son started. It probably started two cereal boxes, the actual boxes, maybe even the cereal in two bowls, where the child can see the choices in front of him very concretely and can make a choice around those two options. That kind of choice making, where we're visually structuring up choice opportunities for very young children, it's a really important part of teaching communication, and building a routine around choice making can provide a valuable platform from which we can build over time. So again, think about, where is your own child along this communication journey and along the communication spectrum, and think about what sort of visual augmentative tools might aid your child in better expressing their wants, their needs, their thoughts, their feelings. And again, it might even just start with basic gestures, basic object exchange, teaching the child even to lead you to what they want rather than them just going and grabbing it themselves. Communication takes two partners. And so one thing we have to work with some young children on is that very idea that one must direct their communication to their communication partner. We see some young children with autism who don't always direct their communication to anyone, even when they are.
That was actually, Louise, that was actually one
Yeah.
reason why we started with that help cue, was that he would not come get a person in
Mm-hmm.
tears. He would just stay where he was and completely lose it, waiting for somebody to magically appear. And so the card facilitated him connecting to a person as well. So it built in that social component of communication.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like a baton. In order to communicate, I hand my communication to someone else. That's a way to
Mhm.
some of our young children with autism in directing their communication when they don't do that very well. And what we're talking about here is supporting and addressing communication that's rooted first and foremost in motivation. What we would strongly encourage any caregiver or professional to do is, when they're supporting a young child with autism and trying to teach communication and language development and social interaction, social communication, is we start with what's motivating to the child. We start by teaching the child to communicate around their wants and their needs. That is fundamental. That is how typical child development occurs. And so that too is what we would want to mirror here. Most children with autism, if we start with other forms of communication, like teaching a child to label items in their environment and things like that, if those items aren't motivating to the child, that's not the starting point. The starting part really needs to be teaching the child to express their basic wants and needs. Because when we teach a child that these kinds of communications can get them what they want, it starts to teach them the power of communication. And that's something we can build on. So when we think about, how do you set up opportunities to contrive motivation? How do you tap into a child's motivation to communicate? These are some really practical strategies to consider within the home environment, preschool settings, and any other setting where we're supporting and caring for young children. Again, really practically thinking, placing those high value items, the things that child loves the most, placing them up high, so that you're setting up an opportunity, a reason for the child to have to communicate with you, before they can just access it freely. Placing items in containers where the child will need assistance to open the container. That affords you an opportunity to contrive a help situation where then the child needs to express communication around help. Maybe they say help, maybe they sign help, maybe they look towards you as if to communicate, I need help. Maybe they hand you the object as if to say, please help me open this. So again, there's all different kinds of forms of communication. And no matter where your child is along the communication spectrum, those are really critical forms of communication to start from. What we want to do is sometimes I'll see folks like hand a child, they'll open up the juice for the child, for example, rather than giving the child the sealed juice box and then waiting. There's a moment where you can target communication if you just don't do it for them. So think about as a caregiver, and I have 3 children, and I do this for, I'm guilty of this, I think, doing things for my children that I really should be empowering them to do for themselves. And for our young children with autism, these are those opportunities where if we don't just do it for them, we are setting up opportunities where they might be able to communicate with us. And what we want to do is set up very frequent opportunities for communication. Setting up a communication-rich environment means we're targeting communication at multiple points across the day. In some cases, many, many times per hour even, when the child is highly motivated to communicate. And so maybe, and what I also, another strategy consider would be segmenting to increase practice. And what I mean by that is if a child wants a bag of goldfish, for example, maybe don't give them the whole bag. First, you hand them the sealed bag, and knowing they can't open it, there's your first opportunity to target communication, help open the bag, right? So then once you've opened the bag, you pour a few goldfish onto the little plate or napkin. And then you wait, they eat those goldfish, and then you have another opportunity for them to communicate and make a request for goldfish. Again, think about where is your child on the communication spectrum? What form of communication might they use to ask for more goldfish? Wherever they are, that's the place to start. And that gets at this point of doing less for them so that they do more in terms of communicating around their wants, their needs, their thoughts, their feelings. And as we've been discussing, arranging opportunities for communication also means arranging multiple opportunities where they get to exert choices and make those choices. And that's where we can visually support those options and use augmentative communication tools in some cases to help them understand what are my choices in this moment. Teaching choice making is really important as well. So just think through how, from a practical perspective, what could you do within your home environments? What could you do with the materials that child is highly motivated to access, or the activities that child is highly motivated to access? How could you set up those situations where they need to communicate in order to access those materials and activities? And try to think about ways to increase the practice opportunities around that. Again, when they're motivated under those naturalistic conditions where the child is motivated to get those things. Here's sort of a basic teaching procedure. It looks fancier than it is. But again, think about it from this perspective. If you know the child is motivated for something in that moment, there's your teachable moment. The first thing we might do is, let's say I'm holding the bag of goldfish in front of me. Instead of just giving the child the bag of goldfish, I'm going to pause and wait and look expectantly. There's the opportunity where the child can communicate. Maybe I need to prompt them to communicate to keep them successful. So I'm going to model the communication response that I want to see. Again, that might not be verbal, but whatever form of communication that child is using, modeling that or helping them to perform that communication response, whether it's a point, whether it's a reach, whether it's a vocalization, whether it's even part of the word open or help or goldfish, prompting them to communicate. And then, of course, as soon as they communicate, reinforcing that communication attempt and honoring it and immediately giving them what they asked for in that moment. And then again, building in those frequent opportunities to naturalistically practice. This is the basic sort of teaching procedure for how we try to address communication in the context of a child's motivation. So what is another key area where that's really a communication rich environment, or a target rich environment for communication, would be in the area of play. And from an early intervention perspective, what we know is the gold standard, best practice in early intervention for young children with autism is that the overwhelming majority of any treatment session, service, whatever kind of services the child might be receiving, even whether it's just parent mediated or parent intervention, that play is a critical context for intervention. Overwhelmingly, we know that this is where a lot of learning opportunities happen. And we love this quote from Fred Rogers, who kind of lifted it and expanded it from Piaget, who's a famous psychologist in child development. But play is often talked about as if it were a relief from serious learning. But for children, play is serious learning. Play is really the work of childhood. And so what I would encourage all of you parents and caregivers out there is, if your child is receiving any kind of intervention service, intensive interventions of any kind, that my hope for you and your child is that the intervention services that they are receiving look a lot like play. That is what we know is best practice in early intervention, that the context for learning for young children is in the context of play and in those natural routines that families engage their children around. So I want to talk a little bit more about how do we target those early forms of play and communication for young children. When we use really play-based strategies and we're thinking about targeting a child's communication that's rooted in their motivation, one area that we're able to affect in some cases is joint attention. And we know that for some young children with autism, joint attention is an area that is affected, where a child with autism might not display joint attention to the extent that we might want them to. And so what is joint attention? Joint attention is where two people are attending to the same event at the same time for the same reason, and they both know that they are. That sounds like a lot, but what I mean is, you see this picture of the little guy pointing towards the fire truck and his daddy is holding him. Little guy's pointing to the fire truck, daddy's looking at the fire truck, little boy's looking at the fire truck, they're looking at it together. And then you know where they're going to look next? They're going to look at each other. There's a triangle of attention there where they're looking at the object, but then they're refocusing on each other. And so we see in some young children with autism that triangle of attention is disrupted. And sometimes what we see is that in some young children with autism, their focus is more on the objects than it is on the social piece of the interaction, or on the person or on the partner. So you can see another example here. The mom of this young baby is playing Jack in the Box, and she winds the Jack in the Box up. Baby's looking at the Jack in the Box, and then as soon as the Jack in the Box pops open, the baby's eyes, we would want the baby's eyes to go to the mother. Because in doing so, what we know from a typical development standpoint is that children learn so much about emotion, perspectives, social interaction, and language development from a very early point by engaging in those early joint attention opportunities. This young baby is learning a lot about emotions from his own mother, because as soon as that Jack in the Box pops open, he's looking to his mother as if to understand, how is she feeling? What is her reaction? And so again, that triangle of attention, though, sometimes for some young children with autism is disrupted, where for some young children, we see their eyes and their focus stay on the object and not shift over to the social partner. So what we are trying to do in high quality early intervention, whether that's as clinicians or as parents and caregivers, is to really emphasize joint attention and do it in a way that's naturalistic, through play and natural routines. We know this is hard for some young children. Play is hard for some young children with autism. Obviously, we see some young children with autism who are very oriented towards building structure and predictability out of things that appear chaotic or seem confusing to them. So whereas some young children over on the right might use this castle with all those figurines in ways that are imaginative and flexible and symbolic, taking on different roles, doing different actions, imitating each other, following each other's leads. Sometimes for some young children with autism, that's really hard. It's not hard for all young children with autism, but it's hard for some. And so instead, what we might see is a young child lining up those figurines, but not really engaging in the play schemes and themes like their peers are doing. We know this is hard for some young children with autism. I was working with a little guy who had a lot of language, but he socially, wasn't quite as flexible. And I get that. He wasn't yet at that sort of symbolic or imaginative point in his play. So I was in his preschool setting. I picked up a toy banana and I was pretending it was a telephone. And all the other little friends around him were laughing and they thought that was so funny. And then they were picking up fruit and pretending it was telephones. Well, this little fellow, this adorable, smart little fellow with autism was, said very directly to me, it's a banana, not a telephone. And so we know that for some young children with autism, there may be some rigidity or inflexibility or difficulty being able to have an object take on a different function, a different role, a different purpose than its conventional function. There are things we can do about this, though. Through the context of play-based intervention, we can make progress in this area. We know for some, and Nancy talked about the hula hoop analogy so beautifully last week, we know that for some parents, and they've said this to us, the hula hoop, though, can feel like a brick wall. It can feel very hard to break through that hula hoop, or rather, I should say, enter that hula hoop carefully and engage the child and try to reach them in ways that are playful and try to build those play skills. That can be hard. We recognize that. This quote from one parent who attended one of our previous sessions I thought was really just powerful. They wrote, I'm learning not to force myself into their hula hoop, but to graciously observe her from the outside of the hula hoop and occasionally visit with understanding. This is tough. And so, Nancy talked about that social gas tank last time, that analogy of the social gas tank, and we do have to be careful and sensitive to the unique preferences and interests of young children with autism. It's not about just invading this hula hoop and making them play with things that they don't want to play with. That is not what we want to do. But we want to enter slowly and carefully and systematically, and starting with their unique preferences, their unique interests. That's the starting point to enter into the hula hoop of play with young children with autism.
I'm just going to jump in and share that, I think the very first time we did that with our son, I think it was even before his diagnosis. And he really liked to, he wouldn't draw for himself. He wouldn't pick up a marker or anything. He would want us to draw, and he would tell us what to draw. He wouldn't come get us to draw a picture. He would first cry and somebody would come. And again, he hadn't been diagnosed yet, but he always wanted us to draw a pizza wheel, the thing you use with the round wheel that cuts the pizza. That's all he ever wanted us to draw a pizza wheel. And so our first foray into entering the hula hoop was to, withhold the markers like Louise was sharing and structure that and say to him, what color? And then only draw part of it for him to have to engage us again to say, draw the handle. And having him point to where on the paper it would go or how big it was going to be. So we were, trying to insert ourselves into that routine and have exchanges. And while it didn't accomplish everything related to joint attention, I think it did start building that repartee between us. And that was the first time we did that. So it is tough, and finding those moments can be tricky. But I think as we talk about it, you'll start thinking about, oh, maybe this is where I can do that.
Yeah, I love that pizza wheel example. You really are rooted in understanding his motivation, his unique preferences and interests, and building
and he
on.
always wanted the yellow marker, by the way.
And a yellow marker, right?
Had to be the yellow marker. I had to buy them in bulk.
And you built in so many communication opportunities through that exchange. And for your child, Nancy, he was verbal, right? And he could vocalize preferences and point and do some of those things. And again, Depending on where your child is, that might look different, but there are multiple opportunities within that pizza wheel example to get at choices, to get at requesting, and to get at shared enjoyment, where it becomes a more social activity than it is an object-focused one. And that's one of the key elements of best practice in early intervention, is that we prioritize social motivation. We want to build social motivation through joint activity routines that build reciprocity and sustained engagement with another person. The back and forth in an interaction is what we're trying to build. But again, we're focused on doing it in a way that's centering around that child's unique interests, their preferences, and that's our starting point for building engagement. And that's also the way that we can start to recruit and increase that child's motivation to socially interact with us. If social motivation is a problem for your young child, this is the way to start to chip away at that and start to teach that young child interacting with other people can provide you with a great source of joy, as long as we do so by starting with that child's unique preferences and their interests. This is also through these joint activity routines how we build communication opportunities. So a joint activity routine is a conversation. It's a back and forth. It does not have to include words, though. And there are so many good examples of this that we can paint for you. The one that Nancy just painted around the pizza wheel is a perfect example of that. She drew a little bit, and then she paused and waited to get more communication from her son. And she offered choices in that context: which way to draw, which one to do next, how big should the circle be. There's so many different ways that you can get a back and forth in that exchange. For a different child, it's going to look different than that. It might not look so complex. So I wanted to show you guys a quick video that doesn't involve any words, doesn't even involve any sound. Forgive me for having to step out of the PowerPoint to show it. Again, you guys are going to have to say that Louise is one of the worst folks at technology ever, because it's very true. So this is me with a little fella, and I just want you to pay attention to what am I working on here? What am I trying to address in this example? This is a child that loves to spin, and so I'm achieving a couple goals here. I'm obviously trying to tie in his strong interest and preference around spinning and make it something social, because I am the agent that can spin him. I'm the person that can spin him. So I'm trying to make a routine that's sensory based, more social, and build on his social motivation. But what I'm also targeting here is communication. And communication is far more than words. So let's watch this video. So in that quick video, you see him directing his gaze to me. You see him looking to me as if to say, spin me more. I'm not telling him to look at me. I would never do that with this child, or any other child with autism for that matter. But what I'm doing is I'm using his motivation, and I'm pausing and waiting to give him more of what he wants. And I'm targeting one of the most fundamental forms of communication in this example. So that quick eye gaze, as if to say, give me more of that. Other forms of communication might work too. It might be him looking not at my eyes, but maybe just towards my face. Or maybe it's a slight vocal approximation. Maybe he says as if to say spin. Wherever the child is along the communication spectrum, that's where we want to start, and we want to do it by building on what's motivating to them. Those are those really target-rich opportunities for building social communication and promoting social motivation. You know, one of the key things that Nancy and I, and that the Autism Society North Carolina broadly, we want to make sure everyone in this audience knows and is advocating for, is that in terms of early intervention for young children with autism, regardless of what kind of services you might be receiving, that there are some critical conditions for learning. And those are that a child is happy, relaxed, and engaged. Teaching a young child, or any individual across the spectrum, through tears or through frustration or through compliance training or demands placed upon that child, that's not really appropriate in early intervention, what we want to do is focus on assuring that the child feels happy, relaxed, and engaged. And we can best do this when we are starting with what are those unique preferences, the things that that child loves to do. How can we build on those unique preferences to target additional forms of self-advocacy, communication that will increase their quality of life in the immediate phase and long range? But it's just so important to think about when we're working with young children that the context for intervention or treatment, the child should generally feel happy and relaxed and engaged. That's how we can best teach the skills that matter most. So when we're thinking about play and building on language skills, again, starting where the child is, wherever that child is in their unique point along the communication spectrum and along the play spectrum. Play is also along a spectrum, from very complex, imaginative, and symbolic forms of play, all the way through very early forms of sensory-based and exploratory play, where maybe the child is very focused on objects around them, and that's their preference. That's the starting point then for how we start to target communication and how we start to build joint activity routines that can become more social in nature, starting where they are. So again, asking you all this question to reflect on for yourselves. In terms of your own child's unique preferences, interests, sources of joy, like what makes them happy? What do they love to do? What are the items or materials they love or the activities they love? What's inside their hula hoop right now? That's your starting point in terms of building interaction opportunities and communication opportunities. And this can look really different for different kids, again, along the autism spectrum. I was working with a young child with autism who doesn't play with toys in a conventional way, doesn't play games or other activities like chase, hide and seek, and peekaboo, and those sorts of things. Those are not, at this point, clear areas of interest for him and activities that he understands. What does he love? He loves coat hangers. That's his unique area of interest. And so this is actually where we start with him. So I'm playing with the coat hangers too. I'm spinning the coat hangers. I'm singing songs with the coat hangers. We're jumping along like stepping stones over coat hangers. So thinking creatively and imaginatively about how do I sometimes take really unusual or unique interests and start to varietize my routines around those to build additional communication opportunities. And how do I start to teach this young child that, yeah, coat hangers are pretty cool, but so am I. And I can actually make coat hangers more fun. That's how you start to build social motivation in some of our young children with autism where that might be lacking. It might be mulch. Maybe they love those sensory materials, or some children are walking the periphery of the playground rather than actually playing with their peers or playing on the equipment even. So if a child is just walking along the periphery of the playground, then I'm going to walk along near them, not right next to them maybe, but I'm going to walk along too. Maybe I'm going to do stomping or singing along the periphery. Maybe I'm going to playfully fall off the side of the playground and see if that attracts their interest, even if it's fleeting. What's the starting point in trying to get engagement? From there, we can build communication opportunities. And so when we're thinking about how do we build a social routine, an interaction routine, building a play routine, starting what's in their spotlight of attention is important. And that's what I mean. If they love coat hangers, that's what I'm going to start with. And I'm going to try to get in their spotlight of attention, not by taking the coat hanger away and not by trying to shift them to a different toy, but using the coat hangers in unusual and creative ways to try to get them to look towards me and to maybe become interested in what am I doing with those materials. In some cases, maybe controlling access. So maybe I hold the coat hanger and I'm waiting for the child to communicate around their request for it, whether that comes through a verbal form or some other form of communication. And I'm maybe giving a little bit and then I'm pausing and waiting and looking for more. So in that example in the video where I was spinning the young child, I gave him a spin, then I paused and I waited and looked for a communication form. And when he looked towards me, I gave him more spinning. That's what I mean in terms of the give a little, then pause. We also want to, when we're playing with individuals with autism, engaging them in a manner that's social, right? We want to narrate and model language using the one level up strategy. So what I mean by that is if a child currently has no vocal language and they're really not using any vocal language to communicate, then I'm going to keep my language very simple, very rationed, using 1 or 2 word phrases to model communication for them, to explain things, to give directions, provide instructions. If a child is using approximately 1 to 2 words on average to communicate most of the time, then I'm going to use and model 2 to 3 word phrases in my communication with them. So modeling and narrating the child's actions. You're walking, jumping, spinning, using language to narrate what the child is doing and what's happening in their environment, but using the one level up approach to do so that we don't overwhelm the child with too much communication. Obviously, when we're modeling language, the aim is that they may imitate and copy that language and then use it functionally in ways to get their wants and needs and thoughts and feelings met. Whenever a child communicates, we want to reinforce that immediately. And then as we're engaging them in these playful routines, we want to repeat and then build in variation. So in the spinning video example, yes, I'm going to spin him a little, then stop, and then wait for more, for him to communicate more spinning to me through his look. Then I'm going to do it again. But how do we build in variation? So what I could do next is maybe then I spin him and then I playfully drop him downwards, not really drop him on the floor, of course, but drop him downwards. Drop. And then maybe there's an opportunity for that variation where not only does he like to be spun, but now he likes that dropping sensation. Maybe from there, I'm playfully tossing him onto a couch, of course, carefully, but tossing him onto the couch. Maybe then playfully we're building in a tickle. Maybe playfully I'm building in a song. So thinking about how do you build in variation? Once a playful routine has been established, how do you start to varietize it, to add more to it? The more you vary those routines over time, the more opportunities you have for communication and varying forms of communication and different types of communication. And then the other piece to this routine puzzle is that as the child's motivation starts to shift away or they get tired of the activity, then you shift and you close it. So in that video where I'm spinning the young child, if I start to see his interest wane, then I'm going to close that routine and try to start a different activity with him. So being really sensitive to those indicators that the child is ready to make a shift. That's also really important when we're trying to build social motivation. Because again, we want the young child to not view us as a source of demand or as a source of overstimulation, but rather we want to keep their social gas tank at the right levels and honor those signs when they're ready to make a shift. In some cases, maybe they need a break. Or in other cases, maybe it's just time to shift to a new playful activity using different materials or different themes. So in that video, you saw an example of a sensory social routine where really we're trying to build on those unique sensory interests, for example, spinning, and we're trying to make that activity more social. Sensory social routines are often a starting point for some young children with autism who maybe aren't engaging in traditional toy play or peer play yet. For some, sensory social routines are really the starting point. So what might those be? Examples of those are things like tickle, or singing songs with finger play, itsy bitsy spider, going up the water spout, and then playfully tickling the child, making silly noises, chase activities, so chasing the child around the room for some can be highly motivating, spinning them on a swing, water play in the sink, blowing bubbles, pushing a child on the swing, pulling them on a blanket, blowing up one of those balloons and then releasing it so the child can see and hear the sounds that the balloon makes as it flies around the room. This is where we can make a sensory opportunity more social. So we're kind of pairing those two together in ways that can recruit social motivation and also, of course, can teach the child ways to communicate around their interests and what they want in that moment. So obviously for some, those sensory social routines are really target-rich opportunities to teach communication. So pushing the child on the swing. I push him on the swing, but then when the swing starts to slow down and it's slowing down, I don't just push it again. I wait for the child to communicate around that request for more. And again, that request can come in a lot of different forms. It might come in the form of the child looking back towards me. It might come in the form of a vocalization, push me. It might come in the form of the child moving their hand as if to gesture, do it again, do it again. So again, think about where your child is, what's the starting point for them, and start where they are, but target communication in the context where the child is highly motivated. And as I've suggested, what we want to do is over time when we're engaging children in playful activities and joint activity routines is start to alter it or varietize the routine, which allows us to expand communication opportunities. So what are a couple examples of that? So I was playing the game Lucky Ducks, this little game you see here with a young child, and he loves Lucky Ducks. He wants to play it all the time. And once we kind of established that routine of playing the game, there were lots of great opportunities for social interaction, joint attention, and language and communication when we're playing Lucky Ducks. What I wanted to do was try to expand away from Lucky Ducks a little bit. And so I used a teddy bear. I brought out a teddy bear and I had the teddy bear chase those Lucky Ducks around the room. And the teddy bear was going to eat the Lucky Ducks when he got them. And the child loved that idea, that theme. And so that was one way, just for that specific child, that I was able to take a game and then expand how those materials were used in ways that were playful and creative and different. I was working with another young child who loves letters and numbers, clearly a very focused interest for that child. And we laid out, he loved to label them. He loved for me to label them. And so what I did with him was we started to play hide and seek with these number tiles. So I would hide the number 2 and he would have to count to 10 and then we'd go and find it together. And then he would take a turn doing that. We also used the numbers and we put them into our play kitchen and we were pretending that those were food that we were eating. And so we would take a spoonful of a number, the number 7, and we would take a pretend bite. And then we'd feed those bites to other stuffed animals, for example, or other figures. So thinking about how can you take what's really interesting to a child with autism and try to playfully and creatively expand. It's almost like violating the routine, not in a way that's going to be upsetting to the child. We don't want to push them to the point of frustration when we alter these routines. But when we start to show them, hey, there's more than one way to use these toys, there's more than one way to use these objects or these materials, it starts to expand their social repertoire. It might expand their play repertoire. And yes, it gives us lots more opportunities to target communication in that situation. We can also do this by pairing new toys and materials and actions and themes with preferred routines. And that's what I was just talking about with the Lucky Ducks example, with the letters and numbers example. So if we're using washable paint, maybe we add rocks to the mix and we're rolling the rocks around in the washable paint on a surface. Maybe the puzzle pieces, a child loves to do puzzles. Well, maybe the puzzle pieces make noises as we put them in. So we are making silly sounds or saying silly things as we put the puzzle piece in. Maybe that attracts the child's interest and it creates a new routine. It adds variety to the routine. Or maybe instead of me always chasing the child around the room, if the child loves to play chase, now I'm using stuffed animals or other materials to quote unquote chase the child. So I'm trying to pair what the child loves with something that maybe the child doesn't currently have an interest in order to make those new materials more interesting and motivating to the child. If a child loves to swing, well, now I'm going to use a pillowcase and I'm going to put the child inside the pillowcase and swing them around. Obviously, the child needs to be very young and small to do that. Or human bowling. So maybe we're playing a traditional bowling game inside the house, but then we change it up. So now you're going to roll the ball and knock me down and I'm the bowling pin. So just thinking about how can you take materials and then playfully use them in ways that are different or pair additional ideas or themes or objects into those routines. That's how we start to expand communication opportunities. It's how we target joint attention and it's how we get at social motivation and expanding play skills. So again, I've done a lot of talking. And what's so important to say here is just you don't have to, everything Nancy and I have talked about today, it's a lot. So you don't have to see the whole staircase. Just take the first step. What's one new opportunity? What's one new situation that you find yourself in with your child where maybe you could increase the opportunities to target their communication in that situation, in that routine? Or if we're thinking about it from the play perspective, what are those objects, those items, those activities that the child currently loves or is really motivated by? How can you start to become a part of that experience for that child? How can you make that more social? How can you add creativity to an existing activity or game or playful interaction that you're having with a child? What else can you add to the mix to expand it, to varietize it, and start to build on additional play skills and target communication? Just take one step. And so with that, I want to just quickly touch on upcoming sessions. Make sure you all are aware of those. On May 18th, we're going to talk about promoting success in daily routines, such as dressing, toothbrushing, and mealtime behaviors. On the 25th, we're going to talk about heading off problem behaviors with positive support strategies. On June 1, we're really going to wait and see what you all need us to do for you in terms of providing a Q&A, offering additional concrete examples, video examples, and so forth. Help you enact some of the strategies that are most important and relevant in your lives.